Welcome to Lunch with the Lord. I'm Pastor Mark. We're going to be starting at Ezra chapter 5, verse 11 this lesson. But before we begin, Jeremiah 15:16, our theme verse for Lunch with the Lord. Thy words were found, and I did eat them, and thy word was unto me the joy and the rejoicing of my heart. Now, we're in the context of the letter that Tatnais and Shethar-boznai write to King Darius. And we start here in verse 11. And verses 11 to 16 are dealing with the reply of the Jews to Tatnais' question. All right? Tatnais writing this letter, and he has questions for the Jews because he wants to report this to Darius the king. So he asked the Jews some questions, and now this is the response that the Jews give to Tatnais. Verse 11 says, verse 10 says, we asked their names also to certify what we might write, that we might write the names of the men that were the chief of them. Now verse 11, and thus they returned us answers, saying, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and build the house that was builded these many years ago, which a great king of Israel builded and set up. So he says here in verse 11, this is what the Jews reply to Tatnais. They say, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth. You know, they were specific in saying that their God is not a local deity or a God of one kingdom, but he is the ruler of heaven and earth. He says it in verse 11, it says, right? It says, we are the servants of the God, not of Israel or the God of Jerusalem or the God of this district. No, we are the God of heaven and earth. It says in Psalm 103, verse 19, the Lord hath prepared his throne in the heavens, and his kingdom ruleth over all. Right? God has prepared his throne in the heavens, and God's kingdom rules over all. Doesn't rule over some. God's kingdom rules over all the earth. But yet this is an absolute tremendous statement that is made in response to their question that we need to learn. All right? There's a principle here that we need to learn from this verse, this response that they start out with. It's that when it is all said and done, we are nothing, and yet God is everything. And any service we do as the servants of God. What do they say here? It says, we are the servants of the God of heaven and earth, and we build a house that was builded these many years ago. Do you see yourself as a servant of God? You servant of the God of heaven and earth? Listen, it's not important who we are. It's important who he is. It's not, when they said to verse 10 is Tatnais is asking, we asked the names also to certify that we might write the names of the men that were the chief of them. We want your names. We see you're building this temple here, and we're not sure if this is okay by the king. So we're going to write him a letter and let him know that you're building this temple, and we're going to find out if it's all right or not. So I want to write down your name. So what are your names? Starting with you over there. What's your name? Oh, I'm the servant. I'm the servant of the God of heaven and earth. Oh. Okay. Well, what's your name over here? I'm the servant of the God of heaven and earth. No, I asked your name. No, I'm the servant of the God of heaven and earth, right? Listen, when it comes down to it, it's not important what our name is. It's important what his name is. He's the only one. God is the only one that's important in this whole thing. We're not, the world doesn't revolve around us or our little community of friends. No, it's he's the important one. Colossians 3, verses 1 through 4, right? If ye then be risen with Christ, seek those things which are above, where Christ sits on the right hand of God. Set your affection on things above, not on things on the earth. Why? Why? For you are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. When Christ, who? When Christ, who is our life, shall appear, then shall you also appear with him in glory. Right? What does he say? What does Paul say? For you are dead, and your life is hid with Christ in God. It's not important what our names are. It's important who we serve. The name of the one who we serve. That's what is important. Christ in you. It's the hope of glory, right? Christ in us is the hope of glory, not us. The world will always want to focus their attention upon people or upon flesh and blood. But we need to turn their attention off of us and onto God. Listen, don't worry about the praise of men. The unsaved world, they're going to want to, oh, you're a great preacher. You're a wonderful teacher. God must love you, right? And they try to put the attention upon you. And if you're not careful, you can get puffed up in pride and arrogancy and start receiving the praise of people when really it's due to God. And so the important thing is it's not who we are, it's who he is. And again, the world will always want to focus upon people, upon flesh and blood. Who are you that's building this temple here? Why are you building this temple? Who are you? Right? Well, you can get flattered by that and say, well, boy, I got a chance to get my name in the papers, right? I can be on the news tonight. I can watch myself on the news, right? You go, I hope I can get home in time so I can see myself on the news tonight. It would be wonderful, right? I hope I got my hair combed just right? And no, the attention, if you're not careful, you can receive that attention for your own vain glory. And yet it's not about us. It's about God. It's about who he is. And it says here in verse 11, and they build the house that was builded these many years ago, right? Now, the original temple that was built by Solomon in Jerusalem was finished about 400 years before this time here in Ezra. And it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar about 85 years before this time. So the temple, Solomon's temple, stood in Jerusalem pretty much over 300 years. All right, for over 300 years, the temple was in Jerusalem. Now, was it in the glamorous, glorious status that it had for those 300 years? No, because a lot of other kings came in and ransacked, and they had bad kings in Judah, and they pillaged the temple for a long time. So it wasn't in the pristine condition for 300 years that Solomon had built it. Okay, it had been, I don't want to say destroyed, but it had been taken apart, and some of the gold had been stripped off and given to other kings for their support. It was kind of a shell of itself by the time it was Nebuchadnezzar destroyed it. it was not as glamorous as it was in Solomon's time. And then it says here, which a great king of Israel builded, right? A great king of Israel built. Now Solomon was a great king. If you consider his wealth and how he was viewed by other kingdoms. So when it says here that this temple that they're building years ago, this temple was built by a great king of Israel. That is true. He was a great king. If you consider the money that he had, the wealth, the wisdom he had, and how he was well known throughout the whole world at that time. Yet his heart was turned away from God for many years. And Solomon did terrible things. You have to understand, we kind of tend to focus on the glorious things that Solomon did, that he made. But Solomon, when his heart was turned away from God, he was a wicked king. He was a wicked king. He did some terrible things when his heart was turned away from God by his wives, and he started building altars and to these other gods, and serving them and worshiping them. Because of the sinful things that Solomon did, God brought the monarchy in Israel to an end. And God divided the kingdom. But at the end of Solomon's life, he turns back to God and he writes 2 more books. And they are the book of Ecclesiastes and the book of Song of Solomon. So was Solomon a great king? Yes, God did love Solomon. God told David, when Bathsheba was pregnant the second time, that God loved this child and God would be with him. And God told David that he would be with this child throughout his whole life. But Solomon, grew up and he was I want to say born with a silver spoon in his mouth, in his hand, but he had. It's interesting how David was a man of war and a man of blood, but Solomon, I don't know. I mean, if he had stayed true to God his whole life, he may not have ever seen a war. He may not have ever seen opposition against his kingdom. But it wasn't until his heart turned away from God and he started serving these other gods that God brought opposition against Solomon. God brought men against Solomon to be a hindrance to him, and because he turned his heart away from God. Verse 12, we're going to finish this lesson in verse 12. And it says here, but after that, our fathers had provoked the God of heaven unto wrath, and he gave them into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, the Chaldean, who destroyed this house and carried the people away into Babylon. Now, the outward profession of religion means nothing when it is just dead religion. Solomon's temple, which was in ruin, was a perfect example of how the nation of Israel was destroyed because of its sin. Listen, God will give a backslidden Christian over to their sin and to the consequences of their sin if they refuse to deal with their sin at the cross and put it to death. God's going to, a Christian who serves God for a while and then goes back into sin, God will deliver them into the consequences of their decisions of living in sin. And you'll as Solomon's temple was a picture of what it means when a religious nation turns against God. So also a backslidden Christian, they are a picture of what, God will give them over to their sin and to the consequences of their sin. It's the same with any of us. If we turn our hearts from God and we start going back into this world and we harden our hearts towards God, God will deliver us over. Doesn't mean God hates us. Yes, God still loves us and he still cares for us. And yes, we still are saved. But if we harden our heart against God and we are determined to live in this sin and to live away from God, God will deliver us over to that sin and to reap the consequences of those decisions. And then it says in verse 12, but after that, our fathers provoked the God of heaven, right? Our fathers provoked. This is what their response was. The reason why they're building the temple, the reason why the temple is in shambles and they're rebuilding it is because many years ago, our fathers provoked the God of heaven. God can be provoked by a willful determination to continue in sin. Don't think that God is so loving and so kind that he never gets angry, he never gets upset. He's like the old grandpa, he's sitting in his rocking chair, sitting in his lounge chair, and the TV's on, and the kids are, the grandkids are raising havoc all around him, and he's just sitting there calm and reading the news. No, that's not that's not God. Understand, God can be provoked if we willfully continue to live in sin. We can upset the heart of God toward us if we harden our heart to go back into sin. And then it says that they carried the people away into Babylon. That's what Nebuchadnezzar did. Carried them away into Babylon. The persistent sinner is now under the control of the oppressor. As they went into Babylon, so the unrepentant Christian goes into guilt. They go into shame. They go into condemnation. They go into insecurity of their salvation. They become the slave to these things, right? As they provoke, because the children of Israel provoked the God of heaven, God gave them over to their oppressor. God brought Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians down, took them over, and hauled them back to Babylon. The children of Israel went into captivity, right? Well, it's the same way with Christians today. When a Christian decides that they're going to harden their heart and they're going to walk away from God and his word and they're going to go back into the world and start sinning again, God's going to give them over to their sin, over to their oppression. And they're going to go into guilt. They're going to go into shame. They're going to go into insecurity of salvation. They're going to start doubting their salvation. Now, in God's eyes, is their salvation lost? No. But in their eyes it is. Why? Because they've given themselves to this sin. And now they start living in insecurity concerning their own salvation. Right? They go into condemnation. They start living in the land of condemnation. They leave the secure land of Israel, and they go into the land of condemnation, into the land of insecurity, into the land of shame and guilt. They start living in that land. They become the slave to these things. Only repentance can set them free. And it's a repentance that comes from godly sorrow. 2 Corinthians chapter 7 and verse 10. It's a repentance that comes from true godly sorrow. So we're going to continue this lesson here in verse 13 next time. All right. But until then, walk with the Lord. I know he walks with you.